I'll start, as is now traditional, with the acknowledgement that the Asper Jewish Community Council is located on Treaty 1 land, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, Dakota, and Oji Cree nations, and the homeland of the Métis. You've heard these a lot, and this is the first time I've had the occasion to make this acknowledgement. It's important, like most quick phrases that are used a lot, that goes in one ear and out the other sometimes, but the sentiments are important, and I hope you'll look into it further as I have begun to. It's a catchphrase that deals with complicated issues in a few words, and they're too important to leave at that. This is an evening, though, to discuss issues of anti-Semitism and populism and what's going on right now. I'm Dan Stone. I'm the chair of the Programs and Exhibits Committee of the Jewish Heritage Center. For those of you who don't know the Jewish Heritage Center, it has two missions: Holocaust education and fighting for human rights in general, and researching and publicizing Jewish history, especially local history of Manitoba and the adjacent regions of Saskatchewan, Ontario, but also more broadly Western Canada as a whole. Some of the kinds of events that we run are indicated by, as you see, our annual major event, the Saul and Florence Caney Distinguished Lecture, this year featuring Bret Stephens of the New York Times, formerly of the Jerusalem Post and the Wall Street Journal, with his talk on the rise of nationalism, populism, and hate, which will be held on May 13th in Shaare Zedek at 7 p.m. We'll be happy to tell you more about it afterwards if you'd like. Some of the other more small-scale but very important events: on April 17th, will be a book launch of Communal Solidarity, Immigration, Settlement, and Social Welfare in Winnipeg's Jewish Community, 1882 to 1930, by Professor Arthur Ross. Arthur is a Winnipegger, son of Ann Ross and Bill Ross, and this book, which he is launching, is a profound work of scholarship, one of the major pieces that has been produced ever in the historiography of the Winnipeg Jewish community. I had the privilege of seeing the book in manuscript and know how much it's going to add to our understanding of the development of the Jewish community. On May 6th, we will have, in conjunction with the Gray Academy students, an exhibit on synagogues and religious objects. That is, their drawings based on pictures of synagogues and religious objects, in part from the collections of the wonderful archive of the Jewish Heritage Center. This will be up for several weeks. And then in late May, perhaps early June, there should be an exhibit and program on the Winnipeg General Strike, especially the Jewish participation in it and opposition to it. And also in the fall of 2019, an exhibit for the 100th anniversary of the Y. So this is the kind of range of activities that we do, and we hope you'll come back to see them. Tonight's program focuses on two speakers or two events. First, I will introduce both of them. Then we will see Paper Nazi, the film by Andrew Wall, who is here, followed by Bel Jarniewski, who will talk about problems of anti-Semitism in the contemporary world. And then after that, there'll be a question and answer period for both of them when you can discuss these issues with them. Then we'll move outside for refreshments. Andrew Wall is a Canadian documentary filmmaker with a passion for finding unique stories and subjects. His award-winning projects have taken him across the globe, from the mountains of Tajikistan to the halls of Oxford University, and pretty much everywhere in between. They've been broadcast nationally on CBC and aired throughout the United States, Europe, and Australia. Andrew's first major documentary was The Paper Nazis, Winnipeg's fascist and Nazi movements in the 1930s. The film was inspired after investigating stories about Victoria Beach in the 1930s, and the film has won many awards. It's still being broadcast and used as an educational tool around the world. Unfortunately, it isn't old history, it's new history too. Other films by Andrew include Suspended and the Art of Forgiveness, Burning Ember, the Steve Bell story, Last Stop to Armageddon, the Camp Hughes story, and a very recent one, The Last Objectors, a story of conscientious objection in World War II. Andrew is a founder and producer of Refuge 31 Films. Following that, you'll hear Bel Jarniewski, the executive director of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada. Since 2013, Bel has served on the federally appointed delegation to IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, as a member of the Academic Working Group and the Committee on Antisemitism and Holocaust Denial. She's also the current president of the Board of Directors of the Manitoba Multi-Faith Council. As a child of two Shoah survivors, Bel has felt compelled to educate students of all ages about the Shoah and other genocides. Among the numerous initiatives she's helped organize and coordinate is the annual Symposium for Manitoba High School students at the University of Winnipeg, which attracts up to 2,000 students. Bel's 2010 book, Voices of Winnipeg Holocaust Survivors, serves as an important document in the history of 73 local survivors before, during, and after the Shoah. Bel's passion for Tikkun Olam, mending the world, has led her to pursue a graduate degree in theology at the University of Winnipeg. Her thesis explored survivor narratives through the thought of Jewish theologian Irving Yitz Greenberg. Believing that actions speak louder than mere words, she has co-founded two interfaith dialogue groups, Muslim Jewish and Catholic Jewish. She's also one of the original founders of Operation Ezra, an initiative to sponsor and resettle Yazidi refugees and to focus awareness on this genocide, which is occurring in broad daylight in front of us. For setting up and organizing this program, I would like to thank Bel herself, who did so much work in preparation, and Stan Carbone, the Director of Programs and Exhibits at the Jewish Heritage Center, who has done much invaluable work for many, many years, and thank the Jewish Federation for its ongoing support for the Jewish Heritage Center over many years. Thank you, and now we'll see Paper Nazi, filmed by Andrew Wall.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for that wonderful film. It's really amazing to me when I watch it now for the second time, with quite a number of years in between. The first time that I watched this film, I don't think it ever occurred to me that today I would be hearing so many echoes of what happened then in what is happening today. But we are. And the late Robert Wistrich, he referred to anti-Semitism as the longest hatred. And of course, anti-Semitism dates back for more than 2,000 years. But as I watched this film, that old phrase came to my mind, plus ça change. The more things change, the more things remain the same. And I'm sure that as you were watching, you were probably hearing these same echoes of the things that we're seeing today, accusations of Jews controlling the media, of being responsible for everything that goes wrong, for globalism, and I could go on and on. Last week, on March 21st, it was the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And each year, the United Nations chooses a new theme. And this year's theme is mitigating and countering rising nationalist populism and extreme supremacist ideologies. And of course, white supremacy was such a big part of Nazi Germany. And the special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, Ms. E. Tendai Achiumi, in her recent report on nationalist populism, analyzed the threat posed by nationalist populism to the fundamental human rights principles of non-discrimination and equality. And she has condemned nationalist populism that advances exclusionary or oppressive practices and policies that harm individuals or groups on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, or other related social categories. And of course, exclusion was a big part of what we saw just now. And in her report on the glorification of Nazism online, which is such an immense problem, she identified recent trends and manifestations of the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and of course, anti-Semitism. And she highlighted the state's obligations under human rights law to counter such extreme ideologies online, as well as the responsibilities of technology companies in the light of human rights principles. We live in, of course, a very different time than what you saw in the film, and the influence of technology, of the internet, is huge in the spreading of hate. We can also absolutely assume that the rise of anti-Semitism is today connected to both the right and the left. So tonight, I'd like to examine the impact of these very difficult ideologies on contemporary anti-Semitism. Now first, a few definitions might be helpful. Of course, the word anti-Semitism originated way back in the 19th century by Wilhelm Marr. And of course, this word in Marr's understanding was a positive word. He was trying to promote this idea of hating Jews. And he focused on the supposed racial as opposed to the religious characteristics of the Jews. And his organization, which was called the League of Anti-Semites, actually introduced this word, anti-Semite, into the political lexicon. And it established the first popular political movement based entirely on anti-Jewish beliefs. And by the way, there is no such thing as Semitism, which is why scholars today prefer to use the unhyphenated form of the word. Of course, this idea of racial purity did not originate in Nazi Germany. It did not originate with Wilhelm Marr. It went much further back, and the idea of blood purity, you heard, of course, blood and soil, which we'll hear again in a moment, originated way back in Catholic Spain, who, in the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, invented this idea of purity, so blood purity. So what that meant is that even if Jews converted to Christianity, they were never real Christians because of their blood. And of course, the Nazis picked up on this later. So then in 2016, we get to what's up there, the IRA definition. The IRA today, an organization of 33 member countries and several partners. The Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial felt that it was very important to elaborate a definition that would hopefully be adopted by many countries, because there appears to be so much confusion over what this word anti-Semitism really means. And often a false definition of anti-Semitism comes from the most unlikely corners, even within the extreme left, especially in the Jewish community. So what you have up there is the basic definition. Now, the IRA also developed a whole series of examples of how it was guided and guidelines of how to interpret what anti-Semitism is. And I won't go into that tonight, mainly because it would take too long. But if you are interested, all of that is on the IRA site, which is internationalholocastremembrance.com. This is a list to date of all of the countries which have adopted the definition. And if you're wondering, Canada is not on the list. However, Canada did adopt the Ottawa Protocols, which are very, very similar, nearly identical to our IRA definition. There are a few small changes. And the US State Department also has a very similar definition. There are more and more countries that have adopted the definition, and one of the main reasons that we felt it was important to elaborate the definition was the rise of the resurgence of anti-Semitism, of the same kinds of tropes that you heard in this film. So what is nationalism? Well, an identification with one's own nation and support for its interests. So far that sounds okay, but especially to the exclusion or the detriment of the interests of other nations. Nationalism, as you are aware, is on the upsurge. Our neighbors to the south, and all across both Eastern and Western Europe. So that expression in the U.S., blood and soil, which we saw in Charlottesville, and that by definition excludes Jews because it has its antecedents in Nazi Germany. And then in countries like Poland today, under the nationalist government, where supporters chanted "Pure Poland, Jew-free Poland" during a November march. And here's a photo from Warsaw of that march in November of 2018. Populism is a political approach that strives to appeal to the ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by the established elite groups. And as you heard, this was also a problem in the past, in history, and it's a growing problem. We know, of course, in the United States that this exists. And so nationalism and populism, they sometimes go hand in hand, but it's not possible to assume that one or the other is limited to either the right-wing or left-wing ideologies today. So tonight, I'd like to look at some examples of contemporary anti-Semitism, how they've been influenced by these ideologies, and I will focus mostly on local issues, but I also want to present to you a little bit about what's going on elsewhere in the world, because they too echo back to what then happens right here. So again, in Charlottesville, which I just spoke of, you note, the wording here: unite the right, end Jewish influence in America, and Jews will not replace us. So among the IRA examples noted are the myth of the world Jewish conspiracy and of Jews controlling the media, the economy, the government, or other societal institutions. So here's the sign from Charlottesville, but in November 2017, in Canada, in British Columbia's University of Victoria, there were posters with slogans like, and you see those triple parentheses, "Those who hate us will not replace us," were found. And the triple parentheses, if you're not familiar, is something that's used online by neo-Nazis to identify Jews. In the UK, Corbynism and the Labour Party, Well, there's a lot to say, so I'll just be brief, but authors Matt Bolton and Frederick Harry Pitts, in their book Corbynism, A Critical Approach, have noted that the movement reflects wider societal, ideological, and political economic shifts that bring it closely in step with an increasingly post-liberal political environment. They demonstrate that Corbyn's populist division of the world into oppositional us and them camps has more in common with the politics of Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, in other words, right-wing politics, than it does with the traditions of leftist democratic socialism. And they have added that Corbynism divides this world into friends and enemies and requires regular heresy hunts in order to sustain itself. In other words, a scapegoat. And who has become the key scapegoat? The Jews. Corbyn has amassed a populist base which appears to be readily attracted to a racist, anti-immigrant, and anti-Semitic ideology. So here in this photo, you see an anti-Semitic mural, which is suggestive, which was up in the UK, which is suggestive, of course, of the myth of the world Jewish conspiracy, such as in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it was called Freedom for Humanity. And the mural, as you can see, depicts a group of businessmen and bankers, and some of them are stereotypically Jewish, counting money around a Monopoly-style board balanced on the backs of men with dark complexions. And in 2012, Mr. Corbyn defended the mural, tweeting to the artist, "You're in good company. Rockefeller destroyed Diego Rivera's mural because it includes a picture of Lenin." And so he was referring to the removal of the mural Man at the Crossroads by Diego Rivera at the Rockefeller Center. And it took Corbyn 6 years to apologize for that tweet, and likely in response to a great deal of criticism. You also see, by the way, that triangle, the Masonic symbol, which is often conflated with the power, the supposed power, world power of Jewry. Corbyn has also made comments about Zionists not understanding English irony, suggesting that Jews are not fully British. And the very word Zionist, or as it's often referred to as Zio, is generally used pejoratively. So while the Labour Party finally adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, Corbyn really expressed a lot of resistance and criticism of the definition for some time, even though the UK was one of the first countries to adopt it, really within months of the IRA's adoption of it. Precisely because of a concern about the UK adopted it because it was concerned about an increase in anti-Semitism in that country. And I want to make something clear here. I mean, one of the things that Corbyn kept harping on was, he said, well, you can't criticize Israel according to the IRA definition because then you're accused of anti-Semitism. That is not true. Actually, the IRA definition is very clear that one can criticize Israel in the same way that one criticizes any other countries. But there are some things that cross the line. So, for instance, saying that Israel doesn't have the right to exist, or comparing the policies of the government of Israel today with those of Nazi Germany. Yes, that is anti-Semitic, and that is criticizing it in a very different way. So Labour MPs, Jewish and not, who have expressed concern about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party have faced many threats of violence, really horrific stuff. And quite recently, 7 Labour MPs, not all of them Jewish at all, resigned from the party specifically over Corbyn's leadership and his failure to respond to anti-Semitism. And one of the Jewish MPs, Luciana Berger, said that Labour had become institutionally anti-Semitic and that she was embarrassed and ashamed to stay. Pittsburgh, you are all familiar with. In the IRA's examples, of course, it notes calling for aiding or justifying the killing of harming or Jews in the name of radical ideology. Well, in this case, the radical ideology is white supremacy. And while it has existed in our country for a very long time, it has surged as a populist manifestation today. And the rise of populism and nationalism globally has given much freer rein to the expression of racism and racism in general, and in particularly anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment. Here's another example, this time in Canada. You may be aware this was a letter that was sent to several synagogues across Canada, clearly calling for the harming and, in fact, killing of Jews. The incidence of anti-Semitism continues to rise, and it's important to note that many, many incidents go unreported, and likely because there's generally an inability to prosecute unless one has threatened or is inciting genocide, etc. Here, of course, we've got an easy one, Holocaust denial and distortion. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story. Monica Schaefer, this YouTube video still exists in which she describes the Holocaust as the biggest and most pernicious and persistent lie in all of history. And she feels so sad that as a child she grew up believing in the Holocaust. She ran for the Green Party unsuccessfully. She expressed her view that 6 million Jewish people did not die at the hands of Nazi Germany. And Holocaust denial and distortion are gaining ground, particularly distortion. And as nationalism gains ground, these two issues are becoming very serious, and in particular when governments themselves are engaged in the distortion of the historical narrative. In particular, I'm referring to Poland. Now here we have an interesting example. This is the kind of online hate that exists. You've got conspiracy myths, but there's a lot more in this picture. The figure in the photo is quite satanic, and there's an attempt, of course, to demonize all Jews, and that stems really from the very early Christian texts, most often understood. So, for instance, the synagogue of Satan is not a reference to Jews at all. It was a criticism of people who hung around synagogues and didn't actually convert to Judaism, because at that time that these Gospels were written, Judaism still remained quite a popular religion. And of course, we were still talking about a sect of Judaism, the Jewish Christians, who had a different idea. And the two religions had not completely split, but there was a great deal of anger among the Jewish Christians that Judaism did still remain popular, and really did until the time that, and even for a short bit after, when Constantine made it a religion of the state. So there's money, of course, at the bottom of the photo, and that's a common illustration in these anti-Semitic graphics. And it suggests that terrorist acts against Israel are actually instigated by Israel itself in an attempt to get more money. As I said, the Freemasons here are thrown in for good measure, and there is a long history, as I say, of attempting to link Jews and Freemasons together in a conspiracy to control the world. The best example of the conspiracy theory, of course, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which charged that Masonic lodges were in the service of the so-called Elders of Zion. And in the 1920s in Germany, publications appeared alleging that Freemason initiation and rituals trained its Christian members to be artificial Jews. And these publications also condemned the Masonic support of Jewish emancipation for bringing quote-unquote alien influences into German culture. The next couple of slides focus on France today. I'm sure you're all aware of the growing problem of anti-Semitism in France. And this first picture shows the German word for Jews, Juden, scrawled on a shop window, a bakery, recalling Nazi Germany's boycotts. And chillingly, this shop exists in the same Paris neighborhood from where Jews were deported during the Shoah. And the French government has really come clean on that history, because Of course, it was not the Nazis who went in and pulled the Jews out of their homes to be deported. In fact, it was the French militia. The Yellow Vests is a populist movement which is protesting against rising fuel costs and their prime minister. And of course, even though the fuel costs have now gone down, the protests continued. But they have employed anti-Semitism extensively during their protests. And so remember here that the Yellow Vests in France are a leftist movement. They've referred to Macron as pute à juif, which means that Macron whores after the Jews. Macron once worked for the Rothschild Bank, and so they accuse him of being controlled by Jewish bankers. And this particular slide refers to an attack that took place during one of the Yellow Vest protests in the street on the very respected Jewish intellectual Alain Finkielkraut. And interestingly enough, the Yellow Vest movement in France, while it's left-wing, has transferred over to Canada, but mutated, because in Canada, it's really the far right that have co-opted the Yellow Vest movement. And antihatecanada.ca accuses Tyler Malenfant, founder and administrator of several Yellow Vest social media groups, as posting the following. This is just an example. Show me the evils of the white man, and I'll show you yet another Jewish lie. So right-wing extremist ideology and white nationalism are truly on the rise in Canada. And many perceive this to be a relatively new phenomenon, but of course, as Andrew so ably demonstrated in his film, it definitely is not. So it's believed that there are in excess of 100 white nationalist and alt-right groups currently active in Canada, according to an article by Seagill in 2017. And so these are you see the newer groups here and some of the long-standing groups. Many of the white nationalist and alt-right groups also utilize music on their websites as a propaganda tool and a radicalization instrument. Here in Winnipeg, 2013, you've probably seen this. Again, this was an attempt to promote the myth that Jews control the media and more, and you see the listing of Jewish people in our community. And Gordon Warren, the author of the posters, said that he felt he had little other choice than to make the posters because justice officials weren't willing to investigate a controversial land swap deal. Now, you remember what we saw in the film, the kinds of newspapers that existed in Manitoba in the 1930s. Well, as I said, plus ça change, your ward news. This newsletter promoted James Sears' New Constitution Party, which is a white supremacist and anti-Semitic and self-described anti-Marxist group based in Toronto. This newsletter has been barred from distribution by Canada Post since 2016, and Sears has been convicted of willful promotion of hate. And that was just this year in 2019. On the day of the ruling, Twitter suspended his account, but his newsletter is fully operational online, and he's actually run for political office, albeit so far unsuccessfully, but he did get several hundred votes when he ran. And so if we have a look at this particular issue, there's so many things going on here. First of all, clearly it's an all-white white supremacist, all-out white supremacist attack. And there's many, many examples of anti-Semitism here. He's calling for the killing of Jews, and he's using the old-fashioned anti-Semitic tropes. So, for instance, he's referring to Bernie Farber, the very well-respected former head of Canadian Jewish Congress and who continues to contribute so much to the Canadian Jewish community. He refers to him as a Pharisee. So, you know, one of the Jewish sects at the time of the emergence of Christianity. Jews are demonized, Satan's. You see the what he calls the Zio-Marxist arrows, and the suggestion of expulsion when Canada will finally realize the so-called truth about Jews. And here is a poster in front of a Toronto synagogue. About a week and a half ago, we had Max Eisen here as our speaker. He is an Auschwitz survivor. And of course, the word Achtung means attention. Watch out for Jews in Holocaust education. The sign, of course, was a sign about Holocaust, promoting Holocaust education. So what's different today? Not all that much. And we have, I'm sure you remember this one too, this was in Wolseley. The reference to the Einsatzgruppen, to the Nazis, there's the swastika. On the reverse side of the rock, there was a threat. It said, forgive me, die Jewish bitch. And of course, a very short time ago, just a few blocks away, Jew on the facade of the Burmax Cafe. These postings in France, on the shop, on the Burmax Cafe, they're of course a reminder of the boycotts in the Jewish shops in Nazi Germany, and this type of thing was painted on the shops. But as we saw in the film, right here in Canada, of course, the same kinds of things were going on. And in Quebec, and for the most part, but also in Alberta, there were boycotts against Jewish businesses. There was a campaign called Achat Chez Nous, from Christians only, and the accusation that, of course, that the Jews were in league with the communists and that they were bringing communism to Canada and destroying Christianity. Of course, it took place during the Depression. And whenever you have a difficult time, we accuse the Jews for everything that has gone wrong. And that's really the basis of the IRA definition too, is accusing Jews, anti-Semitism, meaning an accusation of Jews whenever anything goes wrong. Of course, the type of blatant anti-Semitism that existed right here in Manitoba, we saw in Andrew's film. But I would like to close tonight on a more positive note. While we are seeing a frightening explosion of hate all over the world, really, this is not 1939. And there was an attempt by these white supremacist, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant movements on the far right to have rallies all across Canada. And they pretty much failed miserably. They were either canceled, or in some cases, they were so completely overwhelmed by the counter demonstrations, and that's a very good thing. We have governments in many countries, including our own, who condemn anti-Semitism outright. And for instance, the French government today is really a leader in denouncing and condemning anti-Semitism. And we now have nearly 20 countries which have adopted the IRA definition. And within those countries, you also have organizations such as the judiciary and the police that use the definition as a guide. And that's very, very important. We have the IRA itself, which is an organization of 32, almost 33, because Australia is likely to gain full membership this coming spring. And 8 observer countries and 8 international partners. And the IRA unites governments and experts to strengthen, advance, and promote Holocaust education, research, and remembrance, and to fight against anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and Holocaust distortion. And that's very important because this is not merely a Jewish organization. In fact, I would say from my experience that at least half of the delegations, of the members of these delegations, are not Jewish. And the work that we can do, the clout that we have in influencing is I think, very important. So when we sit in that room, and despite all of the very hateful things that are going on in the world today, when you sit in a room and you see the representatives of all these countries speaking up against anti-Semitism, we do realize that it is a very different world today and that we have the power to counter this kind of hate. And in fact, it's our responsibility to speak out. And more, that is exactly what we are doing all over the world. So I thank you very much. And I'd like to invite Andrew to come up and answer any questions that you might have. I guess we'll need the lights up.
If I could just thank Winnipeg MTS On Demand. They kind of stuck their necks out for this. Their mandate was to tell community stories, but usually of a lighter fare, not quite so heavy. And Cam Bennett there said, no, this is an important story to tell. And so about 10 years ago, this sort of got rolling to make this film. And then we completed it about 9 years ago, as well as the Winnipeg Free Press, which was so gracious in letting us use all of these papers that you see.
And Andrew and I are taking this on the road. We were invited to reprise this presentation later in the spring in Morden, Manitoba. And I think that that's wonderful because it shows the interest that exists for this very important subject.
If there are questions from the audience, Stan Carbone has a microphone so that we can all hear the question.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your presentation. I want to tell you that I was astonished by Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitic. I didn't know that. But I was shocked to find that the Green Party candidate in Alberta is anti-Semitic. I was a Green Party candidate, and not in Manitoba, several years ago, and I was just couldn't believe it. And practice out my place to speak for Elizabeth May, but I will. Elizabeth May would have absolutely no patience whatsoever for any member of her party running with those kind of issues.
Yeah, she did speak out and condemn when this video came out. She spoke out and against Monica Schaefer and condemned her beliefs, definitely, yes.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Can we try this without a microphone?
If your voice projects, why not?
Beautiful presentation. The key thing that comes to mind is, are we just preaching to the choir? Can we get this out to everybody?
Well, I don't think we're preaching to the choir. I think if you look around the room, this audience is very varied. And the fact that as soon as the article about this evening appeared in the Winnipeg Free Press, we were invited to speak in Morden, Manitoba, which is definitely not the choir.
It's making it difficult for me.
You're getting your exercise, Stan. I think that the fact that we do have a state does certainly make a difference. I believe that if the state of Israel had existed at the time, 6 million Jews would not have been killed. I think that the world understands that the Jews are no longer stateless, an inability to protect their own. So certainly it does make a difference, but then of course, really from the time of the beginning of from 1948 onward, but especially lately, despite the fact that, you know, one can legitimately criticize certain policies, which I and many others do, and many Israelis do, there is a singling out, there's an obsession with Israel that certainly does not exist as far as other countries which are, you know, human rights violators, and they simply seem to be forgotten about. There seems to be this obsession with Israel, with this idea of what Zionism is, which it isn't, and so there's that as well.
Question for Andrew.
Excuse me, there's just one person here, then.
No, one person here first, Bob.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to ask you, do you feel that because this is how I feel, that the criticism of Israel, the BDS movement, the universities who criticize Israel so harshly, entities such as MCC, other Christian communities that are very critical of Israel, and have tours that are really very one-sided and have very little positive things to say about Israel. Do you feel that that is also contributing to the anti-Semitism and the atrocities in the world today?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said before, there's this complete obsession with Israel. Why is there no BDS against the many, all of these countries where people are being murdered every day? Why, my association with Operation Ezra. Where is the world to speak out against what is this genocide against the Yazidis who were murdered, persecuted, little girls raped simply because of their faith? Where's the world? Where's the world about North Korea, Syria? There's so many things that go on, but there's this obsession with Israel. Where are the programs at these universities to shine a light on what is happening in those other countries? I rarely hear of them. It's just Israel over and over and over again. And as I say, there's nothing wrong with criticizing Israel, but there's a difference between criticizing and demonizing and suggesting that the country doesn't have a right to exist.
Bob?
I think you're a pretty young guy yet, and 10 years ago when you started, when you made this film, you were even younger, of course. What motivated you to choose this topic, and tell us a little bit about how that evolved in your psyche?
It really did start with the cabin at Victoria Beach. There was a film festival that was looking for short documentaries, but they had to be serious and about truth and about the human journey. And I had no idea. I was just sort of going through my head, well, what would work? And it's like, well, there was that rumor at Victoria Beach, which was, not a rumor. But to me, I suppose I'd grown up that Canada was a wonderful place where everybody got along. And, this was 10 years ago, we had Sam Cates as a mayor. Izzy Asper was a prominent businessman. I never imagined that the Jewish community could be outsiders. I grew up with Jewish friends. And so when I sort of Googled it, all of a sudden I saw I guess it was an essay by a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Fines, who was at Grant Park High School, and William Whitaker was in it. And then it covered Victoria Beach. And I thought, wow, within an hour, because all these newspapers had come online, I had like all these pictures that I was staring at. The opening of the documentary has all these swastikas. Well, that's exactly how it was in the picture, and we tried to replicate exactly that. I was stunned that this was here, that this happened here. And so really it was that rumor of Victoria Beach. It was for a short film that I was thinking of doing, but it eventually became a much bigger film.
I understand that there were some prominent Winnipeg families involved in the Nazi Party in Winnipeg. Did you come across their names in your research?
There was some Mennonite families. There was sort of a whole variety, but no, none that I recognized in particular.
Because Jonathan Wagner was featured in your film.
Yeah.
He did talk to some of those families, I understand, and they denied having any role with the party, and he went to Germany and actually got their Nazi membership cards.
Oh, wow. Jonathan Wagner wrote Brothers Across the Sea. He wrote it in the 1970s. He was really excited about when he finished it. He thought it was very important to talk about it. And he said there was almost zero interest in his book. So when I drove out into North Dakota, Minot, he was thrilled that somebody was actually bringing light to this story, because he thought in the 1970s people would be, this is important. And far from it. He said it just didn't get any sort of attention whatsoever.
I'll just add that Jonathan was a history professor at the University of Winnipeg when he wrote the book in the 1970s.
Let me get to you so I can give you the mic.
I had been hearing about the rise of all of those, like, I've read statistics in the paper about even just the last 5 years, how many more very white supremacist groups have popped up. And I follow one Facebook thing that sort of exposes it's called Yellow Vest Canada Exposed, and it and it's not just even what their terrible things they say about immigrants and Jews and Muslims, but it's also how, whether it's talk or not is not for me to say, but they're threatening really violent action. They call people who've been elected traitors and much worse. They say they should be hung. They're threatening violent action, and I'm wondering. I've heard for a long time that Canada's anti-hate laws are very weak. They've hardly ever been successful. Has there been a getting together of the IHRA with maybe some lawmakers or lawyers to come up with, to propose hate laws that actually have much more bite to them?
Well, of course, an international organization, can't really develop hate laws, for other countries. But what is happening, because really what you describe is a problem with online hate, and it's difficult to prosecute online hate. The person, there has to be some kind of proof. It's very easy to say, oh, well, I didn't write that, or make all kinds of excuses. But what is happening in the IRA is actually when a country joins or applies to join, they have to do certain kinds of studies or projects. And one of the things that Australia is doing is developing a tool to track online hate. And one of the authors of the tools was on Australian television just last week, noting that this person who had committed this horrible crime, killing 50 people in a mosque in New Zealand, in Christchurch, had actually, been vocal. And one could trace his online hate. And he also referred to the very unfortunate comments made by one of the Australian members of Parliament. But this is what they're trying to do, is to track online hate, And eventually, the hope is that there would be some way of changing our legislation to make it easier to prosecute these people. It's very hard. I mean, I received a call at work here where this person who had, no fear, he didn't hide his phone number or his name, and he called me some very, very filthy names. He said some really ugly things about Jews, and then he said, "You deserve to die, you Jewish," and I can't say those words in this company. I did report it to the police, and I eventually got to the hate crimes unit. And this is a person who is known to them, he lives in Brandon, and he calls the police in Brandon almost on a daily basis to complain about Jews, about Indigenous people, about Black people, you name it. And they know, I mean, the police officer said to me, if you really want, I can hand this over to the Crown, but I know the Crown will not go ahead. Because our laws are such that if he had said to me, rather than "you deserve to die," if he said, "I'm coming there in an hour to kill you," yes, then he would have been prosecuted. But, I mean, to me, someone says you deserve to die, I think that's pretty serious. But no, under current law, it's not. And that's also why many crimes go unreported, because we know nothing's going to happen. So yes, I do think that hate laws all over the world need to be changed, need to be strengthened. And unfortunately, of course, while free speech is important, I believe that there is a line between what is free speech and hate speech, and that demarcation is extremely important and needs to be clear. And there are too many people who defend hate speech under the guise of free speech.
I was going to say that many of those images that I saw on the screen now create such a sickness in my stomach, the same sickness that I had when I was 10 years of age and was receiving an education on all of the horrors of war. I'd like to make a couple of points. One, you said you'd like to end on a positive note. I found a very positive aspect in that film is when you take words and attitudes and then they turn into action. That's when we hope people will stand up.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Nationalist Party, as it was portrayed across Canada, at least from what I saw there, it was squashed. And it was squashed by what I feel would be the majority of people. I don't know whether I'm right in that feeling, but I feel proud to be Canadian, knowing that the Nationalist Party never really gathered any ground. And those individual pictures showing what happened to one-time powerful people just disappearing makes me feel very good. And I would like to finish with this. You mentioned online hatred. In the past, in that film right there, the hatred was paper. The paper turned into action. People in brown shirts driving around the city with a swastika, wearing a leather jacket. I would hope that if any of that came to Winnipeg, that it would be squashed in less than 5 minutes.
I think that in Winnipeg, and thank you, I think that in Winnipeg, I would agree with you. I think that it's just the examples of the attempts to have these rallies that were a total failure in Winnipeg. But I still think we must consider, I mean, look at what is happening in the United States. I mean, when you look at the numbers at those rallies, and when you look at the support for these ideas and the belief, I mean, the whole idea of fake news is coming again, the distortion, it's a real problem, and in many European countries as well, and certain parts of Canada too. I think it is a problem. I think there are pockets. The fact that someone like James Sears can still spread this kind of poison. But more important, and you know, make no mistake, there are people who support him, who read it, and who are encouraged by those thoughts, just as Stormfront from out of the United States has radicalized many people to think that the idea of white supremacy is the way to go, and that it is okay to commit violence against minorities. And it is a real and growing problem, but you're right that fortunately, at least up until now, in Winnipeg, there has been a very good response to this kind of hate.
Almost 9.
Did you say one more?
It's almost 9.
Okay, I think if there's one more question, and then, is there another question?
I just wanted to respond. Hopefully, we would see a lot of those right-wing groups that rally in the United States when there was such hatred for black people in the United States and when they were trying to gather rights. We had Canadians go down and join those marches.
Mm-hmm.
It would say a lot for us to go down and support those who hate the white supremacists.
And indeed some have.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Well, thank you very much. If you'd like to, pardon? Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay, my name is Leo Schmidt. I'm a Mennonite, and I'm wondering what I can do to convince NCZ, which is Mennonite Central Committee, to not be part of BDS. And I'm pro-Israel, by the way.
Well, I think that there are many people in our community who've had this discussion. I've had a discussion with the leaders of Canadian Mennonite University, and I think that there are many fine people who do understand how serious the problem is. Unfortunately, there is a lot of there's a lot of material that is spread in the community that is very one-sided, as Leona said. I think the more people that speak up within the community, the better, because I think that it's more accepted when it comes from within the community. But, you know, when certain speakers are brought in that are not only anti-Semitic, but who really, you know, speak untruths, they foment anti-Semitism. I don't think that these people should be brought in. I know that there was, last year, there was a speaker that was brought in who put up on the screen, I don't know how many of you were there, and I didn't go, but I did see this afterwards, something from, I mean, Jews also have right-wing extremists. We all have them within our communities. And what he had put up on the screen was a tract written by a very ultra right-wing group of extremists in Israel, which has been indicted by an Israeli court. And what he suggested was that that was Judaism, that according to Judaism, it was okay to kill Christian children, for instance. And if you go there and you hear that, and you don't know enough about Judaism, you might think, well, why would he lie? He's a well-known person. He wouldn't lie. He's a member of the clergy. I think the more that we inform ourselves as well, and we talk to others, the more we can help. But I thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Andrew, for the film and for your contributions. Thank you for staying and discussing this important topic. Let's continue over coffee and cookies just outside.